let's get started. So you guys have met Nick Langan. I am pronouncing your name correctly, right?
Langan, just
Langan.
Langan, as if it
All
was,
right.
I guess, GIN, but
Got
that's
it.
fine. That's fine.
Okay. And I first saw an article about him in Radio World. I guess it was like the November issue, and we've had talks ever since. He has the application called RadioLand, which hopefully many of you downloaded. A really slick program. I haven't met a person yet who didn't care. They were really impressed with the application. And so Nick is going to explain how that all came about today, and also his experience and what it took to, he's not going to talk about the development of the software so much as what it took for him to get to this point of providing this application. So thanks for being our guest today, Nick, and go ahead and take it away.
No, thank you again, Mike. I'm honored to be here. This is a thrill. Sort of as you alluded to, I've given presentations on this, but geared toward software engineering undergrads here at Villanova. So I hadn't really been able to talk deeply about what went into the radio side of this application, which was, everything to me. So it's an honor. My name is Nick Langan. And yes, feel free if you have an Apple device with iOS, so iPhone, iPad. We do run, if you have a MacBook with the M1 Intel chip. So that basically the MacBook has to be 2020 or newer. You can run iOS apps. And so RadioLand will run on that. And then any Android device, phone, tablet as well. And that's how you can, just search in the App Store or the Google Play Store. We have pretty decent what's known as search engine optimization now, as far as if you type in RadioLand, it usually comes toward the top as far as in the app stores go. So thrilled to be able to share with you kind of what went into, first of all, coming up with the idea just to build this. And maybe you all will find interesting specifically to try to make what is available in the app meaningful from a technical perspective. There were a lot of considerations, and I'll try to cover them. Feel free to stop me anytime if there's something unclear. I'm happy to take questions at the end, as many as you have. But once I get going, sometimes it's hard to slow me down. So please feel free if there's anything I can clarify. I'm happy to do that. So I put together some slides to sort of help guide things today. So I'll go over sort of where the idea came from, and that goes into my background, the signal prediction methods. So if you're new to the app, the whole key to the project is RadioLand obtains your current location from your device, or you can search for a location, which I think is powerful. And based on a set of coordinates, latitude, longitude, it produces these stations on FM that you ought to be able to hear based on different thresholds in decibels. And I'll talk about what I considered to try to get accurate predictions. And as you can kind of tell, I ended up ended up choosing Longley-Rice, which many of you probably are familiar with as far as a propagation method of determining propagation. So I'll talk about what I've observed anecdotally as far as strengths and weaknesses, some of the features of the app, and kind of what I might have planned next. So it's important, I think, if I tell the story of RadioLand, to sort of go into my opportunity here at Villanova. I sort of got a new leash on life, at least academically. I'm in my 30s. I'm 37. And so I hadn't finished my undergrad degree. And part of it, I've always been interested in radio. That was sort of, on the air, kind of what I wanted to get into originally when I was going to school. I got an internship here at a station in Philly. That turned into IT, that turned into internet radio, which obviously is not particularly lucrative. Ended up enrolling here with transfer credits at Villanova in 2018. Got into software. I had always used computers, done some, HTML basic website design, but nothing, nothing hard core programming or anything like that. But I found it interesting. My undergrad degree was in information systems. In spring 2020, I'll talk about this a little bit more because that's sort of when this started to gain traction in a course I was taking. I finished my undergrad degree and decided to go for my master's in software engineering, which I wrapped up in this past summer. But if not for Villanova, it's not as if this opportunity would have just, the wherewithal, the knowledge to be able to produce this. So I am eternally grateful. And that's kind of why I'm still here, at least part-time, because in fall of 2019, I had the opportunity. I kind of thought, I knew of WXVU here at Villanova. I figured, I'm past my prime, radio's behind me. I ended up getting involved and I sort of rediscovered, I know radio, I know you all live it. It's certainly a lot different now than it was, say, 15, 20 years ago, for sure. But college radio, non-commercial radio, I think a lot of cool things are happening. And I feel like we sort of, on the precipice of WXVU maybe going away, we've been able to sort of steer the ship. So I'm proud to be part of the operations here. And then I'll get into DXing. So the WTFDA, that's the Worldwide TV FM DXing Association. They've been around since, I believe, the 1960s. And so I became a member at the urging of a good friend, KC2MTM, Michael. He's up in the Princeton, New Jersey area, joined this club and I'll show you a picture of it, put a, APS 13 Yagi on top of your house. I went from, basically nothing to this very large 13 element Yagi. But I had always, not so much sort of the nuts and bolts putting equipment together side of radio. I had always been fascinated by propagation. Like, wow, I'm not supposed to be hearing this FM signal, and it's coming in on a summer night. I'm sure, a lot of you may feel the same way. That always fascinated me. And so joining the WTFDA, I started doing this, I spent too much time during the summer looking for E-skip, tropospheric propagation. I'll get into that a little bit here. And I am another one of my passions. I love it's hard to find on the radio these days, but the smooth jazz music format, I am all about that. So yeah, a little bit more just to, get to know why this sort of happened. I felt like it would be appropriate to talk a little bit about FM DXing. So really since 2005, that is the year. That's the antenna still on top of my house in Tabernacle, New Jersey. That's where I live in Burlington County, about 30 miles east of Philly. With that APS 13, it's tough. DXing in a metro area these days, just because of the amount of signals that are on the air. There's actually a phase mode on one of the newer SDRs, the SDR Play RSP Duo. If you ever have any questions about it, always happy to talk about DXing. Contact me offline. Diversity mode, the antenna combining diversity mode, where you use two antennas to phase out an unwanted signal, is very much a game changer, particularly trying to, say, get rid of IBOC interference on an adjacent channel. I make use of that. I heard a signal from Iceland, at least a couple of seconds back in 2021. That's my farthest catch. Rabbitears.info, I'll mention that website a few times because its proprietor, Mark Colombo, was such a instrumental part, still is, of making RadioLand happen. You may be familiar, Rabbit Ears is more geared toward TV, but they introduced last year a live reporting FM tuner map, where basically via software, via an SDR, software defined radio, every 5 minutes, based on the SDR software, it uploads, basically the SDR scans the entire band in 3-second intervals, and it reports out to rabbit ears. So I have a link there if you want to check it out, what I'm hearing right now. Obviously in January, it's not particularly interesting as far as conditions, although I think there's been some modest tropospheric enhancement around just because it's been rather mild. And I'm being that talking to you folks in Virginia. Actually, I have to say, I'm thrilled to come to Virginia. It's always an enjoyable experience. I just like it down there. Maybe someday I'll live there. But just prior to Christmas, I did a little trip to an Airbnb that my family had stayed at back in the summer of 2021, not thinking it was not a DX only trip, but I realized it's in the quiet zone west of Stanton, where obviously signal transmissions for astronomy purposes are restricted. And I realized, wow, this is a great spot for FM DXing. So I wanted to come back one year for the Geminids meteor shower that happens in mid-December. And so the signals you're seeing plotted there, I logged via RDS in about a 3-hour window the morning of December 14th. That's when that meteor shower peaks. A lot of cool stuff with meteor shower. I won't get into propagation too much, but sporadic E is typically, E-skip is, between about 800 and 1400 miles, the E-skip donut. Meteor scatter allows you to hear signals at a little closer distances than E-skip. And there were some surprisingly close signals that I'm not quite sure are meteor scattered. It could have been some airplane scatter. Not quite sure the propagation mode, but it's a great spot to set up. So I want to get back there again, maybe for an E-skip opening. But fmlist.org, that's a great website. If you have any DX interests, they have a lot of data. They have data that I've been interested in trying to use for RadioLand as well. So that was at an Airbnb in Highland County. Great spot. So as you can see, radio has been a lifelong interest. And then also, I think the travel use case. Now, I know it's different. It's not, the 90s anymore. You're probably, if you have CarPlay, or Android Auto, or are you going to necessarily be scanning around for FM stations, riding the Pennsylvania Turnpike? Maybe, maybe not. But if you're looking for an NPR affiliate, maybe, if a news story is happening, I still think that use case matters. So I'm originally from Ohio. All my family's from New Jersey. And so growing up, we would do a multitude of trips across the Pennsylvania Turnpike through the 4 tunnels. And it was always sort of frustrating, not knowing what stations were available, say around Bedford or Breezewood, or going through Westmoreland County or places like that. So that always sort of stuck with me. And then as radio guides, radio websites started to come online, 100,000watts.com. Some of you may remember Chip Kelly, I believe, was the designer of that. That was a great site. And I'll talk about Radio Locator, an excellent website that very much was an influence on what I decided to do here. And then, as I discussed, it's one thing to have this idea, but to be able to execute it, you have to have the knowledge, you have to have the wherewithal. And so that I've been very lucky. I am not an expert by any means. I don't, I learn every day. As far as a software developer goes, I have a long way to go, but I never would have been here without my opportunities here at Villanova. So I'm very appreciative of that. So just want to talk about one guide. Obviously, there was the M Street Journal back in the late 80s, early 90s. Actually, before that, Dr. Bruce Elving, I'll give a mention to. I think he passed away maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. He had a book called The FM Atlas that was very DX oriented. You look up a state, you could see where stations are plotted, you could see their signal strengths. I only knew about that after joining the WTFDA, but a book that I distinctly remembered was from a family trip. I think it was my father was on a business trip to Boston, in the summer of '95, and in the Copley Square Mall, I remember a bookstore, this essential radio guide, and basically sort of the same concept. It would list markets, the stations that are broadcasting in those markets by format, by signal power. I remember I already had the interest into smooth jazz back then. And I remember it indicated that WPLM from Plymouth on 99.1 in Boston was running that type of music, and lo and behold, it was. So I thought that book was so cool. And I found an article from Billboard back in '95, and Jeffrey Dingle, the author, talks about how, he was in a rental car on a trip to California, and he was so frustrated because he was searching for FM stations and did not know what anything was. And so he decided to compile all of this data. There were a lot of parallels. Obviously, back then, internet's still in sort of its infancy. It had to be done in book form, but I thought that was fascinating. So I always remember that book. And there are other guides similarly back then that I think influenced where I wanted to go with this, probably more in a technical direction. That's how this ended up, as opposed to the traveler. But I don't want to forget that use case as well. I often find myself, and the trip I just did to Virginia, for instance, I feel like that's where it comes in most handy when you're on the road looking for stations. And Radio Locator, a definite shout out. I'll be doing some comparisons. In no way do I want to disparage Radio Locator. I think it's an awesome tool. I think it's amazing that it really has not changed in 2 decades. That's the user interface in 2003. That's the user interface today, and it works. You put in a location, it generates a location dial, both FM and AM. I'll talk about their methods, what they use a little bit, what I've been able to glean anyway, and how they do it. But it's a successful model. Obviously, that they've been able to make a living off it. I think it's a developer who went to MIT, originally built it in the late '90s. They have the membership packages. And so on the free level, you only get 15 or 20 searches on a daily basis, but it's a model that works for them, and it's an awesome resource. So we'll go to spring 2020. I had this idea. I was, gaining knowledge, finishing my courses here at Villanova, and in particular, a course that was most inspirational, I think, and this was the pandemic semester, March 2020. We all went home here. And so I was lucky enough to have Kristen Obermeyer here. I'll mention a professor at Villanova who ended up being my thesis advisor. And she taught this software engineering course. And it was the first time in my life that, based on my courses prior, I started working in some of the different programming languages. But this allowed me to actually, what software developers call, ship something, a very basic prototype for a radio location mobile app. And what stood out to me back then, what was also a driving force, again, it's 2020 by then, the game is different, but there wasn't really a mobile app that did this sort of thing. In other words, here's where I am. What stations should I be able to hear based on a propagation formula, not just based on distance? There are dozens and dozens, probably thousands of streaming radio apps for Android and iOS. TuneIn, obviously iHeart, Odyssey, they all have their own. There's many others, many ones that, just a multitude. But all those, they may have geolocation built in. Many of them do. So they'll be able to pick up your coordinates and show, here's the stations in your area, you can stream them. But A, they're all based on streaming, which is fine. I mean, obviously that's a huge part of the industry right now. But B, it doesn't really translate to, if I turned on my radio, would I be hearing this station? And so, simple concept, perhaps you might consider it antiquated, but I always thought it was a bit of a void, that if there was a mobile app that just did that, by your location what FM stations you could hear. And I figured you should be able to see them on a list, but you should also be able to see them on a map. I think, a mobile app particularly lends itself to, here are the stations within a certain radius of my location that I could hear based on adjustable thresholds. And then, I really thought this was sort of a pipe dream as far as being able to execute it, but I would love to be able to show predicted coverage area on a map as well, some sort of overlay. So as far as in software development, sort of what are the requirements? Those are the very high level requirements that this undergraduate course allowed me to dream of. It didn't guarantee the execution that came later, but as you can see, that was a prototype in a different software development kit that was able to see the light of the day. So that was very inspirational as how this all got started. So then I ended up enrolling in the master's program, and they have it's a 3-credit course. You do it for the entire semester. It's called a grand challenge. And basically you take of your own choosing, a software endeavor, or it could be a research project. And over the course of the semester, it's up to you to execute it. Try to meet some goal. And if you want to, you can turn your findings into a thesis, into a full-fledged thesis. And I knew, once I decided to enroll in this program, and it was because of Professor Obermeyer talking about it, that I wanted to do this, and if I was going to do it, it was obviously going to be RadioLand. Like that's, that was everything to me. So I registered. And so the summer beforehand was, I needed to do research because building it in the form of software was going to be hard, but it was achievable. It's not like I'm, moving mountains as far as building a mobile app. That's something millions of people do on a daily basis. But as far as getting those accurate signal predictions, I did not really know where to turn in the summer of 2021. So I needed to do some research in that regard and sort of put together what this application should look like. Radio Locator needed to at least be the baseline as far as how their signal predictions operated, but I wanted to shoot for, and this is obviously vague, this is not how we would, phrase it in the software world. You need to be specific with your requirements, but can RadioLand be more accurate? Is that possible? The data that I use has to be trustworthy. As far as the stations listed, I don't want to see stations that haven't been on the air for 10 years, incorrect call signs, slogans, and formats. That's still an ongoing, maintenance thing. But that's the idea. Doing all of North America was important to me. There are Canadian and Mexico listings in Radio Locator, but the functionality is not quite the same. So if I had access to that data, I definitely wanted to use it. Some sort of number on the field strength or signal strength of the stations, some sort of numeric value. And from the onset, I wanted to make sure there's quite a few stations operating from directional antennas. That obviously impacts the strength of signal you are receiving at your location if they're directing away or sending 70% of their ERP toward you. So I needed to consider that. There were obviously software-specific requirements as far as what are known as quality attributes in software development. How responsive should the app be? I think the magic number I had in my head was within 10 seconds, the user should be able to see the list of stations that is produced when you search for a location. As I mentioned, both a list view of stations and the stations plotted on a map. A lot of search features available, which in retrospect, I don't know how often they get used in the app, but I feel like they needed to be there. So if you could search by format, search just to look up the call letters of a particular station, that needed to at least be available. Something I'll talk about a little bit more. Geolocation is important in the sense that this doesn't really have to do anything with predicting signals, but if I'm going to predict based on where you're at, the phone needs to have a name of the place that makes sense. In other words, a town that maybe in some database exists or subdivision, but is it meaningful to you, the user? It would be preferable just to have the township name or the county name. So that's another consideration I kept in mind. And again, doing a mobile app, which it's funny now, I think there's, just a year or two later, there's almost a gravitation, not to abandon mobile apps, but there are developers considering, instead of being sort of bounded by Apple and Google Play, to do apps on the web and just direct users what are known as progressive web apps. So that is a consideration for me, but I wanted to get this in the app stores. That was the goal. And just good, clean software development practices, no different than your own broadcast engineering profession. You can cut corners, you can, get a feature coded a certain way, but what happens when you need to come back to it in 4 or 5 months, say, so I can add Major League Baseball affiliates? Do I have any idea what I was thinking 5 months ago? That's very important in software development. And so all those things were considerations that I needed to keep in mind. And, I am not a marketing genius. I do not have an MBA. Perhaps I'm short-sighted here, but I wanted to keep this free. No search limits, no membership. In applications, there's freemium models, pay per feature, maybe have like a membership tier. I wasn't really interested in that. Now, it's not free to keep this going. There is, I'll talk about it, a Microsoft Azure cloud space I'm using. That does cost something, but to get it off the ground, to get this idea into the wild, to see what people think, I wanted to keep it free, and as long as I'm a part of it, that's what's going to happen. So in the summer, the considerations, looking at how to predict FM signal field strengths. What are the methods? And what I was familiar with, at least in summer 2021, FCC contour data, and then just reading about propagation studies that had been done for Wi-Fi, for cellular data. I had taken a couple courses on machine learning, and so I had the idea in mind, maybe I could use contour data and try to improve upon it with a training data set, maybe based on locations, mountain locations and valleys, and try to improve upon that. Or even, if push comes to shove, try to build some sort of formula based on, if I'm 50 miles away from this station, how strong should it be? These were all considerations that had pros and cons, more cons with the latter. So contour data, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, easily available from the FCC. The FCC has a very large data set you can download for no cost for every licensed station, and depending on the station's class, at the 54, 57, or 60 decibel level, you get the typically circular contour. Straight from the FCC website, though, obviously, the contour, the signal does not stop at the contour line. They can be received well beyond on ordinary equipment from the contour, from the station's transmitter. And so you need to extrapolate. If at 60 dB, the signal is this, at 50, you extend the circle out, and so on and so forth. That works. Talk about it a little bit with radio locators predictions, but it's not perfect. And there are instances where that may not be accurately representing the signal at fringe, or even just beyond local distances. And this stood out to me in particular, that the FCC contour data only considers terrain obstructions between 2 and 10 miles from the transmitter. And so you think about it, you may be in a spot in a metro area where the terrain is rather even in a circle, in a circular radius of 10, 15, 20 miles or so around the transmitter site. And then maybe you have a mountain range 25 miles to the northwest. If you're just using contour data that is typically produced, it's not going to reflect that obstruction. And as far as producing accurate signal strengths, say in a fringe location with a mountain range in between, the result is not going to reflect that. So that was eye-opening to me. And one of my favorite examples of this, this is in Northwest New Jersey, in Sussex County, Franklin. This is about, you can see right there, about 40 miles from the Empire State Building. And you see the extrapolated circular contour that you can find on Radio Locator. And, around within 2 to 10 miles, I think, as it said there, 8 miles, the average of the Empire State Building, you might have the Palisades that are along the Hudson River. But all in all, the terrain is rather flat. That's New York. That's the area. It's not like there's giant mountains, running up the Hudson River there. If you go out into Passaic and Sussex County, you get into several pretty serious mountain ranges. And I can tell you the ground truth, if you're riding Route 23 up there in Sussex County, the New York stations take a big hit, particularly once you get on the other side of that range. And so, based on the extrapolated contour predictions, you'd have a decent fringe signal based on that little signal strength graph on Radio Locator. And if you were just to extrapolate it out where my cursor is, that's about the location of Franklin. The truth is much different based on the mountains, and that isn't taken into account just extrapolating contour data. So that was a big consideration as far, if I'm going to use this data, it's going to end up resulting in the same predictions. It might predict a 50 decibel signal in Franklin for the Empire State Building signals, when in reality, it's probably much less. I've not been here, but I have a friend I'll mention a couple of times, Bryce Foster, a DXer who's been a huge help with this project. And north of the San Rafael Mountains, which I believe on the front range of it, if you're heading toward the LA basin, that's where Mount Wilson is. That's where the Los Angeles FMs broadcast from. On the other side of the San Gabriel Mountains, towns like Lancaster and Palmdale, again, you see the contour there. There's probably some degree of attenuation that the contour reflects because the mountains are right there. The ground truth is much less, even just being 25 miles north of Mount Wilson, as far as the actual field strengths of the signals. The map on the right there is actually from RadioLand. That's with the terrain view. More so just to show you, these are some serious mountains, around 10,000 feet in elevation that are obstructing the signals from LA. And so again, the contour, it might reflect it to a degree, but not actually considering the obstructions is a large consideration as far as producing signal strength. So that I thought was a very relevant example in an area I'm not as familiar with, but obviously a very populated area out there in Southern California. And then I could just use distance. The Haber-Sign formula just between two locations using coordinates. But where is the predictive value when you're considering stations at different classes with different signal protections, grandfathered allocations, translators, LPFMs, all, it's not an even playing field. If it was, we might just be able to, again, concoct some sort of formula taking into account ERP and height above average terrain. But there would be, I don't think that would have any value, and probably be far less than just using contour data. And so, as far as using distance, one of my favorite examples is between DC and Baltimore, where you've got the co-channel 105.7s from York and Catonsville, Baltimore, within just about a 40-mile distance, and then adjacent channel 105.9 from Woodbridge in the DC market. And so, between the three stations, it's probably about 80 miles in length. And so, if you were just predicting by distance, and obviously not considering that these stations do operate from directional antennas as well, you might think that you'd be able to hear one of these stations in each other's market, when that is obviously not the case. That's probably one of the more short-spaced, if not the most short-spaced examples of FM stations operating. These are all Class B stations in a very small radius. And I think a perfect example of why you'd want to at least employ some sort of propagation formula, as opposed to just considering by distance. And so the other avenues that I at least took a consideration toward, but decided, as far as time, originally this was, trying to do this in one academic semester. That's, 3-4 months max. Taking a look at wireless propagation studies. Oftentimes these were at 2 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz and just not applicable to the FM band, let alone trying to consume them and build some sort of equation to predict signal strengths for FM broadcast. And again, machine learning was appealing to me. More time would be necessary. As far as what does that mean, training data, it would be gathering observations from all across the country in different environments, the Rocky Mountains, maybe in New England, maybe at the coast, and comparing actual observations, maybe with, signal strength measuring equipment, to what is actually being observed, and then being able to compare observations that are produced via contour extrapolation with the ground truth to try to produce a more accurate prediction. I don't think it's impossible, but you might be talking 5, 6, maybe 10 years to put together that sort of data set, at least done in a predictive way. You could probably do it quicker, but I don't know if it would have any value. And so that leads me to Longley-Rice. And so, I'll be honest, I was not familiar with it, or at least familiar with its use for signal prediction as far as broadcasts until the summer of 2021. And so the story dates back. Anita Longley and Phil Rice. Anita Longley was a complete pioneer as far as a female engineer at that time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so they collaborated on developing a model back then. I think its primary use was for military applications, predicting transmission loss over irregular terrain. The ITM model is its formal name. And so it began getting use in the 60s. And even today, the whole TV repack Longley-Rice was used by the FCC. Various communication spectrum studies, Longley-Rice, the propagation formula is employed. I thought the whole history of it was fascinating. And the fact that 20 megahertz to 20 gigahertz, the FM broadcast band obviously fits right in 88 to 108, as do a multitude of widely used bands these days. So understanding that it's all based on terrain data, that's critical to a terrain model, what you're giving it as far as terrain samples go. So I became familiar with it with the help of Mark Colombo. I'll talk about him in length. He is a employed at the FCC. He runs rabbitears.info. And so you can, with his signal search map, it's basically the TV version of RadioLand or Radio Locator. You plug in a location on Rabbit Ears. It's been around since 2008, and it'll give you the TV signals that you ought to be able to decode, along with a host of coverage maps. It's an unbelievable resource. There's a site called FM Fool. You might be familiar with. I think it's still active. For a while, it appeared like it was orphaned. That was actually a resource I wanted to reach out to when I started this project. But it has an updated copyright date now. I don't know who exactly maintains it, but on FM Fool, you pick a location and it sort of builds a study of the signals you should be able to hear with decibel levels, and also whether it's the propagation is line of sight or one edge, two edge. It's a really nifty resource just to see what FM signals are possible. There's also a TV Fool version of it as well. And I believe fmscan.org, that's a site based out of Germany, also uses Longley-Rice. I couldn't find too many other consumer grade applications. There's a host of professional based signal studies, probably some of which you are familiar with, that very much use Longley-Rice. But I became fascinated with it as soon as I found out about it. And that's thanks to Mark Colombo, his official title. He is the Associate Chief of the Video Division at the FCC. In his spare time, and it's quite an endeavor for his spare time, he runs rabbitears.info. It was founded back in 2008. So that June, thanks to Bryce Foster, the friend I mentioned, he suggested, why don't you reach out to Mark? He kind of does this sort of thing with Rabbit Ears. I told Bryce about, I want to build this mobile app, but how can I make FM signal predictions that are accurate? So I had a really long phone conversation with Mark that June, and he maintains an application that the FCC puts out for free. Anybody could do this, called TV Study. It just needs to run in a Linux environment. And so they developed it because of the repack to try to space everything together properly. There is a GUI version of the application. Check it out. It's available for free on the FCC website. I'll talk about it a little bit. You do need a decent amount of storage space for all of the terrain data. But the FCC's OET released it back in 2013 to perform interference analysis during the repack. And so with that in mind, it was built for TV signal analysis. However, it has several different command line utilities, including a signal path loss function. And basically what you need to do is give TV Study two sets of coordinates, the receiver location, the transmitter location, how high of an antenna that the receiver is using, how high the average mean sea level of the transmitting antenna as well, and then the frequency. And so you have the ability with this command line function to choose either propagation curves or Longley-Rice. And so as I just talked about, yes, TV Study is built for TV, but Longley-Rice is 20 megahertz to 2 gigahertz. That would surely incorporate the FM broadcast band. And then keeping in mind, I want to build a mobile application here. TV Study requires somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 gigabytes of terrain data. There's certainly no way, even with the size of iPhones now, nobody wants on their iPhone 14 a 55 gigabyte mobile application, not to mention, that's just the terrain data and not considering, anything with a database or the app itself. So the way Mark explained it to me that afternoon in June, you could certainly pull this off. There is no reason why you couldn't. But if you want to build a mobile app, you're probably going to have to get a server involved because unless you can figure out that there is a Python, the Python programming language based implementation of Longley-Rice that I briefly checked out, that may have been possible. But still, I would need the terrain data is the engine, the terrain data, the samples based on coordinates. The elevation is, at this set of coordinates is 1,800 feet at this. That makes the whole model tick. That requires quite a bit of storage data. So understanding the necessity for storage, I wanted to do this. I thought, this seems, first of all, so achievable. TV Study, the program is out there. It's available. I can download it. I set it up on just a laptop I had at my house that summer. And I thought, this now seems real to me, these predictions. So just at length, and this is more after the fact, some of the anecdotal observations that I've observed using Longley-Rice to make signal predictions. So I think it is particularly apt at finding signals that outperform their contour projections, even if all things were equal as far as the symmetric circles at 60, 50, 40 decibels, just due to originating from a higher AMSL mean sea level than where the receiver is at. And so it also, I think, helps indicate sweet spots where signals on the fringe can be heard. Maybe in a valley, you wouldn't be able to hear this signal 70 miles away, but at this even level, maybe it's just a plain, maybe it's farmland, maybe there is an elevation. Longley-Rice does a phenomenal job highlighting those circumstances. And even I'll talk a little bit about DX mode that I have in the app, which I haven't done a whole lot of testing about, so I'm always hesitant to promote it. But even the field strength values at very low levels, say 25 decibels, if we're using the criteria I came up with is 40 is sort of the cutoff for a weak signal. Anything under that is going to be pretty hard to hear unless you have an antenna with fairly high gain. Even with a Yagi, the observations that I've seen with signals at 25, 30 decibels, I think there is some predictive value. I think you start to lose it a bit at lower decibel levels, but it's still there. And then that Palmdale, California, San Gabriel Mountain or San Rafael Mountain example, I have found that Longley-Rice, just based on the data it's considering, does a really good job with terrain shadowing. And I'll talk about a few examples. So I mentioned my home base, Tabernacle. It's very much in the heart of the coastal plain, probably the heart of the coastal plain in southern New Jersey, in the Pine Barrens. It's about 90 feet above sea level, which for South Jersey actually is notable, I guess you might say. Not any hill in particular. It's just a little bit more elevated versus the average terrain. And one aspect I've always noted, and again, just sort of anecdotally, is the signals from the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania that transmit, serving the Allentown, Bethlehem market, and then to the southwest of that from Reading, always come in very well in my area, despite that being 60 to 70 miles. And typically, if you look at contour projections, even extrapolated, typically Tabernacle is outside those projections. Longley-Rice picks up on that very well. You can see this is from the RadioLand map view. And so orange corresponds to a signal that's 50 decibels or greater. And I believe WLEV 100.7 is above 50 decibels, despite being about 62 miles. I think WRFY, which is not even a full power class B, it downgraded a couple decades ago, that puts in a 46 decibel signal according to Longley-Rice, and I think that's spot on. And so right there, in my own backyard, obviously there is some degree of bias there. Obviously, I'm taking the observations, but I was very impressed from the onset, showing these signals operate, west of the fall line, from decent elevations as far as AMSL goes. I think WLEV is above 1,000 feet. I think WRFY is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 700 feet. And so terrain, dumping down into the coastal plain is something I think Longley-Rice picks up on very well. The Sussex County example that I mentioned with the contour extrapolation. So this is in RadioLand. And you can see here that if we consider 40 decibels the cutoff from Franklin, that little blue dot that's right here is where the search is being conducted from. The New York City FM signals are not even that they do not make the threshold, according to Longley-Rice. And I'll talk about a little bit where I think that might overdo it in some situations, but I think it's spot on here. I think anything east of that mountain is attenuated quite a bit. And so, whereas the contour extrapolations indicated, probably a fairly decent signal, it's only about 40 miles to the Empire State Building. Longley-Rice, not considering distance here, it's just considering the signal path loss. And I think it does a really good job in that circumstance. I'll use a Virginia example as far as comparing, first of all, contour extrapolations with the signals that originate atop Poor Mountain serving Roanoke, including 94.9 WSLC, which has a massive signal. First of all, the extrapolations, don't take into account to the northwest, the mountains across Western Virginia and Southeast West Virginia, whereas that's the Longley-Rice overlay that's available in RadioLand. And you see there is signal loss to the northwest, but I also found it interesting that Longley-Rice does a nice job of showing down into North Carolina. This is Wake County in the triangle, and you may not be able to hear WSLC all the time, because adjacent channel WQDR runs IBOC. I'll talk a little bit about the interference flagging feature I've got in the app now. But even at 120 miles, that's a 51 decibel signal. And I can tell you just from going through there earlier this year, that's accurate, that the WSLQ, WSLT, WSLC, WVTF on 89.1, they all get out very well to the southeast, again, originating from a much higher mean sea level to down there in the Piedmont area of North Carolina. I think Longley-Rice does just a phenomenal job. I'm blown away sometimes with the results. So I was really happy, in some of the tests I was doing that fall with that. And also Canadian stations. So this is an example of Canada being included in the app, first of all. And I had a friend that just went through Western New York. This is probably not far from the Buffalo Bills stadium there in Orchard Park. And he had noted that even not being that far from a Class A in the Buffalo market, WZDV, he was hearing Brantford CKPC 92.1. And so terrain, I think, is to explain for this. It's not just that, Longley-Rice has a better handle on stations originating from Canada, but at 84 miles, it predicts a 52 decibel field strength for CKPC, which was accurate. My friend was hearing CKPC on a day without much propagation, cutting into WZDV, riding along, I think it's the Southern Parkway there in Orchard Park. So one of the things, not just as far as signal strength realities, but I think that's one of the advantages to having full-fledged Canadian data in the app as well. I'll talk about that. But for equal interests, obviously, I want to make sure you as the consumer knows what you're getting in the app too. Some of the observations I've found that are weaknesses for Longley-Rice, again, it's not perfect. That's the one thing Mark Colombo told me back in June 2021 from the onset. Longley-Rice is not perfect. There are weaknesses. He's observed some using it for TV signal prediction. And so its strength, being a terrain model, can also be its bugaboo, so to speak. Particularly, I have found in fringe suburban areas that are hilly. And so, locations west of the fall line, west of New York, west of Philly, west of DC, over penalizing for terrain shadowing. I've observed it with our own station here, WXVU. It's a little too optimistic regarding signals with low ERP values. And then I had to account myself for dealing with signals that are either vertically polarized or horizontally polarized. I had found, and again, this is receiver dependent as well. Are you using a Yagi? Are you using a straight up vertical on your car as they often were, or the shark fin model now? It's maybe a little more horizontally polarized. And then there is a known flaw that's been written about with Longley-Rice. I don't think this is as much of a situation here in the East with the Appalachians, but certainly with the Rocky Mountains, handling knife edge diffraction as well. And so I've observed anecdotally some of this. I've received reports as such. I'll use one west of the DC area, south of Harper's Ferry, riding on US Route 340, that's Jefferson County there. And I distinctly recall I was getting DC signals such as WJFK with the strength to decode their HD carriers at listenable strengths riding along US Route 340. RadioLand, using Longley-Rice, was predicting for WJFK, for example, a 37 decibel signal. As a result, it wasn't even showing up in the search results. And so there's a terrain profile path feature in RadioLand. And so you can visualize, you can see, based on the same terrain data that TV study is using to predict the signal path loss, you can see what that path looks like. And so I'm just guesstimating there's a peak somewhere in Jefferson County that looks like it's about 840 feet or so with elevation, that Longley-Rice must be considering the DC stations are taking a hit here as far as it reflects in its formula. And so this has been a bit of a recurring theme. It's certainly, I and the way Mark sort of advertised it to me as well, from a listener perspective, I'd rather be pleasantly surprised by stations I'm hearing versus seeing predictions of stations that I can't actually hear. And I think I agree with him on that. But this is a theme that I've noticed anecdotally, just in a wide variety of testing the app. Easton, Pennsylvania, in the Lehigh Valley, east of Allentown, Northampton County, Pennsylvania. That's 43 miles from Roxborough, where the Philadelphia stations originate. It's got a 19 decibel signal level for WIP FM 94.1. Again, sort of the same story as the West Virginia experience. There's a variety of hills in Bucks County and Northampton County that I'm pretty sure Longley-Rice is considering when predicting the signal path. In reality, it was a borderline HD signal of WIP in that area. Similar observations across Lehigh, Bucks County. So again, it's in these fringe circumstances anyway. It's not like it's happening 10 miles from Roxborough, but between 35 and 55 miles, if there's modest terrain differences, I've noticed some over penalizing, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. And then I'll use a Class D station licensed to a local high school here in Delaware County. I can say, if I'm trying to be the first person to do it, but I don't think WXVU has ever been heard in the state of New Jersey. I don't think that's happened. But Longley-Rice insists it's possible, including from Woodbury, where I have this sample here. It's got a 49 decibel signal level of WXVU. The ground truth is that you're only able to hear WWFM, the classical station from Trenton, which I'm not even sure that it's predicted in this sample. So there's a few reasons. Why is it just low ERP signaled stations? You also have to consider it may be no coincidence these stations aren't as engineered as properly, don't have as well-run facilities as your major market class B stations or, full power signals. So it may not just be low ERP, but I have found more than a few examples of Longley-Rice maybe over predicting WHHS, another example of that, 52 decibels. And again, it might be heard somewhere in New Jersey with a very sensitive antenna, but it's certainly not in not a 52 decibel signal level. So just considerations that I felt were worth bringing out there. And then I just mentioned polarization. So during my thesis research, I think I came upon the number 86% of FM stations in the US transmit circularly as far as sending similar amounts of power, both vertically and horizontally. I had noticed in particular, WXVU here is vertically polarized. We send 100 watts, but it's all straight up. It's all vertical. In those situations, Longley-Rice was definitely over predicting field strengths to the point where I felt I had to do something before I made this public. This was during beta testing last fall. And I also put a number to cap it. If there is a mismatch, for instance, I think some of the New Orleans Class C stations run 97 kilowatts vertical and 100 kilowatts horizontal. I didn't want to make any penalty for that. That certainly, that's minimal, that's fractional. But in situations where I settled on 25 kilowatts ERP, if there is a mismatch between what the station sends out horizontally and vertically, I settled on a 5 decibel penalty for those stations. So that does reflect in RadioLand. And, a catch-all number like that is never going to be perfect. But I found that did a pretty solid job through testing. This is receiver dependent. Again, with my APS 13, at home on my roof, it's not going to hear vertically polarized signals well at all. Whereas, if I had a car with an antenna straight up, I've had cases where, despite the gain of the APS 13, if the signal is vertically polarized, I'll hear it better on an ordinary car radio. So, there was some consideration too. Should I make that adjustable in the app? If I'm using a horizontally polarized antenna, a Yagi mode versus a car mode, I sort of decided keep it simple and try the penalty. That's what I'm employing in RadioLand right now. So TV study, just to get back to that value that I was delighted using Longley-Rice to be able to produce out of it. It produces signal path loss from one location to another, transmitter to receiver, and you're inputting a frequency, you're inputting transmit AMSL and receiver height above ground level. I then need to adjust that for ERP. That's the formula that RadioLand's server uses because obviously the station's ERP matters. So that formula in every calculation you get as far as what a field strength is at your location to produce the actual field strength value in decibels, that's the formula that's used. Now, talking a little bit more about, all right, so we have this wonderful command line application, the strengths, the weaknesses being considered. I never wavered in wanting to use Longley-Rice. There's, again, not perfect. And in the coming months and the coming years, as long as I can keep it going, if I can get something better in there, I will try to pursue it. But just I've been very happy overall with its prediction accuracy and values. So we have the mechanism to make the predictions, but you're only as good as your data. I could have the slickest looking mobile app known to man. And again, talked about it a little bit at the onset. If I'm using, if I've got stations that haven't been on the air since the 90s, or, a bunch of, what would bother me most is seeing a bunch of stations that have applications that aren't on the air yet, maybe construction permits. I think to some degree that is valuable as far as seeing the CPs, seeing the applications, but there are avenues where you can look that data up now very easily, fccinfo.com for one. So I just wanted, within a very expedited manner, as far as if there are changes, they reflect in the app. So, and this was, again, Mark Colombo at the FCC. He was my point person for the FCC's LMS database, where every broadcast entity is indexed. And so everything you see in RadioLand as far as call signs, frequencies, ERP, antenna height, the directional pattern field values, I'll get into that a little bit, digital power for US stations, that comes from LMS, and it's updated every night at 4 a.m. My server makes a call to the LMS website, updates the data, reruns the script that updates my database. That's how it's done. And I think, as far as a trust level, as far as a comfort level, particularly if you're using this for, day-to-day purposes in your business or your station, that data needs to be accurate. To supplement that, obviously, we know these stations based on their slogans, particularly commercial stations. And so logically, being part of the WTFDA, the WTFDA started this database probably 2014 or so, maintaining based on, and what made this possible is based on facility ID. Every FM station, every TV station, medium wave has a facility ID in the FCC database. The WTFDA took it upon themselves to try to maintain slogan format RDS data for all these stations. And so, considering I wasn't going to build this myself, there are some pay databases, I think, out there, obviously on a budget. That is a consideration. I had access to this WTFDA database. It's not perfect trying to cover the entire country, and they also cover, I'll talk about it, the Caribbean, Canada, Mexico. There are imperfections with the data, but it's pretty solid, and it made it easily achievable to have slogans, to have formats linked to every station in LMS. Over this past summer, I added Nielsen market data, what if the particular station is in a US Nielsen radio market, the name of the market, if it's an NPR affiliate, NFL, MLB broadcasters as well, all to try to sort of gain trust. It's one thing to have a nice looking application. The data matters entirely. And that's something I very much enjoy doing, just, maneuvering, wrangling with the data, you might say. But as I talked about, I wanted Canada in there. I wanted Mexico in there. So thanks to Mark, he uses Environment Canada's broadcast database for rabbit ears. And he explained to me what he does. And I used that as a template for importing Canadian technical data into RadioLand. So it's just like the US data. All the technical data, call signs, ERP, directional patterns, that comes from ISED. The format data is from the WTFDA. The Mexican IFT, they have data up there, but it's all in scanned PDF files as far as the concession documents for all of their allocations. It's not impossible to employ some sort of OCR reader to scan those documents into a database, but that's, for now, I decided the WTFDA has undertaken indexing all of the Mexico licensed FM entities along with the Caribbean, Bermuda, and so I'm using everything as far as technical data. So that does not allow me, for instance, to consider directional patterns in Mexico when calculating field strengths or in the Caribbean. So that's something I'd love to improve upon as we go here, but it still allows, I think, to at least some degree, accurate predictions in those areas. And I felt it was important, particularly with Mexico, border locations, San Diego, El Paso, all along in Texas there, to be able to have Mexico in there, even if it was just for U.S. interests. And obviously, if you travel to Mexico City, any of the points down there. So that is how the data looks. And so in doing a mobile app, you have to consider responsiveness. RadioLand is entirely dependent on an internet connection. If you've used it, you may have noticed this. If you turn on airplane mode on your device, you're not going to get listings. Someday, I would love to pursue sort of like a Google Maps-esque offline mode feature, not index the entire database, but maybe some of the database, maybe pre-calculate field strengths and try to tap into that. So in software development, it was very important to try to meet, I mentioned 10 seconds as a max at a different threshold, use what's sort of known as landing zones. Can we meet between 5 and 7 seconds to return this list of stations? And so this was particularly important when trying to calculate the field strengths of a bunch of stations within a certain amount of radius from a location. If we were calculating, hundreds, it was going to take a long time. So before we even calculate the field strengths, how do I limit the amount of stations queried from the database to make this possible, to make this app responsive to meet those landing zones and benchmarks? And thanks to Bryce, we settled on the idea of using class and range flags. So again, as a benchmark, 17 stations took about 3/4 of a second to calculate. That means running it through TV study, doing those calculations via Longley-Rice. So if you think about a location like around BWI, where you're calculating both the Baltimore stations, the DC stations, if you're in a fringe mode, any of the areas from Frederick to Annapolis, maybe the Eastern Shore, that easily could be over 100 stations. So you just do the math. That certainly could start to exceed 10 seconds. So we established these class flag values that directly correspond to the station's broadcast class for both Canada and the US. Outside Canada and the US, we do these by ERP. And so you see Class C stations with a higher value, translators, lower value, so on and so forth. This corresponds to, first of all, in RadioLand, there are different signal thresholds. So if you do a search, you could do a search with the strong threshold that cuts off signals that are below 60 decibels, all the way down to DX mode. That's the sort of unbridled 25 decibel level. There is a bound box. What that means is the database is queried. That's every station in North America based on your coordinates that you give RadioLand. So let's say in Petersburg, Virginia, I'm querying, I want my FM dial. So the database is queried out to 150 miles, northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast, 4 directions. That's very fast. Querying a database is, maybe a second, maybe not even. It's calculating the Longley-Rice that takes some time. So we use the range flag based on the threshold that you've got RadioLand set on, and the class flag of each station in the query to determine if we should even consider what its field strength value is. So that's a very crude mathematical formula. Take the class flag, divide it by the distance to your location, multiply that up by 100, and then compare that to the range flag that I just showed you, 18, 12, 7. If it meets it, we calculate the signal path loss. If it doesn't, it's not considered. by and large, with some edge cases that I've had to tweak here or there, that's worked very well. And we've been able to use that to meet those responsiveness benchmarks. I feel, happy that we haven't had to compromise on that sort of thing. And so that's very important because, basically computational time is something any software project has to consider, because at the end of the day, even for more of a niche project like this, it shouldn't be taking 30 seconds. That's a lot of data consumed, first of all, if you're using a cellular connection. And it's just, we live in a world where these apps run very fast. So that needs to be optimized. And there's probably things down the road I could do. I would rewrite the code to this app differently than I did, in the fall of 2021. So these are all things that I would need to consider.
Hey, Nick.
Yes, sir.
We kind of need to wrap it up. I definitely want to ask you some questions, and I believe the math here, we get it. Did you have any other relevant things to share? I wanted to ask a couple of questions.
Sure. No, I would just, the only thing I would probably just go over, probably the most recent that you might find interesting. So I mentioned it just briefly. I'd be curious, anybody could check out, we have flags for interference for the stations that are listed. And so that basically considers same channel interference if there are cases where HD sidebands generate interference. This is something that just garnering feedback from users that has been appreciated. So basically, it's indicated with a little yellow triangle on the app. So something you might want to check out. But by all means, I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
You just answered one of the questions, so I was going to ask about interference. How many downloads have you had so far?
In the after the article was run, somewhere in the neighborhood, probably about 1,500, somewhere in there. Yeah, Apple makes it difficult to find the total amount of downloads. So, I realize it's very much, it's not something that people are going to go out of their way to search for and find. But I've been very happy. I feel like, in particular, as far as the broadcast engineer audience goes, it's been that's where I feel it's spoken to most. And as as a developer, you're always sort of searching for who are your stakeholders, who are your your primary users. And I feel like it particularly with the help of the article and Radio World, that sort of led me there. So I've been thrilled with some of the responses I've been getting so far. So
anyone else with questions? All right. Well, hey, I'm going to get up with you after this, Nick, if that's okay. But thank you very much for the presentation today.
No worries. Sorry, once I get going there, it's hard to stop me. But
No.
I appreciate it. And if you have, if anybody has any questions, feel free to contact me offline. I'm happy to discuss. So.
Yeah, they can get that. I can't remember how I found you. I guess it's on the Radio World article, right?
Correct. There is, I'm pretty sure there's an email there.
Yep.
You could just do my first initial n.langan@villanova.edu. That's probably the easiest way. n.langan@villanova.edu.
Well, this was very insightful. Thank you. I definitely learned a few things. And chapter 54, do you want to conduct a meeting now?
Well, I don't really have a whole lot to announce, other than we're going to have another presentation next month. Mike, as you well know, I'm talking to Beam Dynamics about that. I'll send out some information about that. We had a EAS warning in from Surrey last month on the 14th. That was successful. I'll send out some more information over email. We don't need to go over a whole lot now, but I don't know if anybody else has any information from the chapter, but that's about what I have at the moment.
Hey, I will tell you, I'm working on a March presentation for us on 5G interference to C-band.
Oh, okay.
So we'll see that. Hopefully something materializes from CommScope.
CommScope sounds good.
Yeah.
I did want to ask a question to Nick. Was it the did you get the IQX or the core system?
So it is the IQX that
Okay.
is so yeah, we with that is what we installed. I believe it's an 8 fader. And so yeah, it is we haven't taken full advantage of it, but we just
Right.
installed it prior to Christmas. So it's really cool. It's
We
really
just
cool.
got a couple of those. We're going to replace our old Element consoles.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
We had an Audio Arts in there. I don't recall exactly the model number, but you know, it dates back quite a bit. I mean, it still did its job. But you know, it was time. It was very much time.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what we switched to as well. So
Yeah, the Axia stuff is great.
it's
So,
awesome. It
yeah.
looks based on what you can do with it, you know, hook it up to digital signage and things like that. It's got very
Pretty
versatile.
amazing. Yep.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Well, that's if nobody else has anything, motion to adjourn for chapter 54 and take it away, Mike.
That's it. Well, I'm gonna get to work. I'll be calling you, Nick. Thank you. Appreciate it again.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Nick.
I really appreciate that. Thank you for having me. I'm again, it was an honor to be here. I really
Thanks.
appreciate it.
Yep.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.